Hi, everyone. Welcome to Positive Behavior Supports in the Classroom. I'm really excited to spend the next 5 weeks with you thinking about how we can support student behavior in ways that are protective, proactive, inclusive, and positive. In this first segment, we are going to start right at the foundation by answering a deceptively simple question. What is behavior? This may seem like something we already know, especially if you're already in the classroom, have worked with kids or with different individuals who have different kinds of behaviors. There are many of us who come from behavior-based backgrounds as well. However, what I want us to focus on, especially in this first segment here, is understanding that the way that we define behavior affects how we respond to it. And what we believe about student behavior is also going to influence every decision we make to address those behaviors. So we're going to slow down and unpack the ideas of behavior. First, we're going to look at, in this part here, Behavior 101, we're going to really work on having a clear definition of behavior. And we'll talk about the factors that influence behavior because it's never actually random. It's never quite random. We'll begin at looking behavior through a more supportive functional lens. And then we're going to challenge some common myths that often come up in schools. And for those who are not as experienced in dealing with behavior, we're going to try to challenge some of those myths and kind of turn them into how to understand behavior and then therefore how to support behaviors. So let's dive in. First off, what is behavior? In its most basic sense, behavior is anything a person does that can be observed and measured. Observed and measured in this world of, special education or education in general really is like where we start to sit and understand in behavior. Observed and measured are things like talking and walking and sitting and shouting and raising your hand and tapping a pencil and smiling, even looking away or putting your head down. Those are things that we are observing and we can measure being how often it happens, when it happens. We can take information about this behavior that we are observing actually occurring. Behavior includes those tasks that we might consider undesirable, like refusing to work and yelling out and avoiding eye contact. But a very important distinction is that behavior is not a personality trait. It is not a moral failure. It is not a diagnosis. Behavior is simply an action. When we are just looking at what is behavior, we have to understand that it is an action. It is not, we're not putting judgments on anything else when we're just trying to figure out what the behavior is. So instead of saying that student is lazy, we'd say that student didn't start the assignment after being prompted. The lazy part being our feelings and our judgments at the time. The actual behavior observed is that a student didn't start their assignment once they were prompted to do that. The shift from judgment to observation is the heart of what we're going to be doing at this course. And I put that in here because when you're dealing with student behaviors, a lot of the times, this is in my personal experience, a lot of the times it can feel quite personal, can feel quite like in an attacking kind of sense where, it just keeps happening no matter it is how many times you try to stop it, what you try to say or do, the behaviors keep occurring to a point where sometimes it can feel quite personal. And sometimes the behavior is directly targeted towards you. And that is what we're trying to understand, that it's happening for a reason. And we're trying to figure out what those reasons are. But first, we also have to learn how to define what that behavior is. All right. So here are we're going to ground in with some simple examples here. And then throughout this course, we'll also have examples for students who have more mild, moderate support needs. And those are students who are typically in your general education setting for the majority of their school day. These are students in my examples here who generally require some supports in learning and progressing in a classroom, but mostly in their general education classrooms with their same age peers and same grade peers. When we look at extensive support examples, these are students who tend to have far more extensive support needs, physical, verbal, all the different types of support needs that an individual can maybe have. And these are students who spend the majority of their day in a separate classroom with a special educator for the majority of their day. It doesn't mean that they can't be in gen ed. They can. There's a kind of a big fluctuation there, but just to keep in mind, we're going to go over examples as the course goes on, and we'll usually use the verbiage here. All right, so we'll start with the student who has mild to moderate support needs. Let's say it's a third grader with ADHD. You'll notice that he's frequently calling out during lessons, even when you've reminded them about reminded the whole class about raising their hands. You feel like you're constantly redirecting this student. When we look at our student who has the extensive support needs, perhaps a non-speaking fifth grader with autism, When given a task he doesn't prefer, doesn't like, he throws the materials off the table, drops to the floor, drops their body to the floor. In both situations, that there's a behavior that might feel challenging. When we're looking at a student who has continuous, constant speaking out without raising their hand, they're disrupting the flow of your lesson. When you are looking at a student who you might be working with one-on-one or small group who keeps like tossing materials on the floor because they don't want to do something, but you're looking at something that's more like frustrating in some ways. And you're like, how do we do this if they won't even like touch the materials? So in both situations, again, these are behaviors that might feel quite challenging depending on who you are and where your setting is. But if we stop at just the judgment part, that's disrespectful, or the students being oppositional, we really miss the opportunity to understand why the behavior is happening. And why tends to be a very big point here. And you're going to hear me say this a lot throughout the entire semester. Behavior is communication. Behavior, all behaviors, everything again that is observable and measurable is some sort of communication that's trying to be conducted. It does not mean that it is communication that is easily understood by everyone. Think of it as its own language. Behavior is like its own type of language, and we have to learn how to interpret it for our students, for our own sake, for our classrooms, for all the other spaces. We have to learn how to interpret this language of behavior. So I have a little pause and reflect here. I want you to think about 2 to 3 student behaviors you've seen recently at your placement, at your job, even at your own life. It doesn't necessarily have to be a student, it could also be adults. We see the same things happen with adults constantly. And as you're thinking about them, write them down or type them out on your own. And I want you to ask yourself, were those behaviors disruptive or unexpected? What was your initial reaction or interpretation once the behavior occurred? What might have been going on underneath those behaviors? So now we're thinking about cause. As you take a moment to jot your thoughts down, this is the kind of reflection that I really want us to start working on, because we're trying to shift our mindset around behavior from what is wrong with the student to what is the student trying to tell me. And I'm also just going to put out there, it's so much easier said than done to shift your mindset from something like this, especially in the heat of moments. So this is something that takes a lot of practice, and I want you to keep that in mind. Now, we've defined behavior as observable, measurable, and some form of communication. Now that we understand those pieces, let's talk about what actually influences behavior. Because again, behavior is not random. There's always a reason. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. Here are just a few of the factors that can impact behavior. We're going to start with environmental. Environmental factors being the physical setup, the noise level, the sensory stimuli. What we're looking at when we're looking at an environment, is the space overstimulating? Are the expectations clear? Is there a routine in place? So let's say we walk into a 3rd grade classroom and, it is the most decorated place in the world. There's so many flyers and posters, and the teacher handmade so many beautiful things, and the desks are all colorful and the chairs are all colorful. And there's so much going on in this classroom that, although very nice and might be really exciting for many students, could be also quite overstimulating for others. So that's something to kind of keep in mind, the sensory of it all being the environment. Environment also looks at expectations and clear routines. So a student can behave an undesirable way for us when there are no real clear expectations, when there's a transition from math to English, or from we finished our lessons, we're going to go to PE, or we're going to go to our specials class, or we're going to go to to lunch. If there isn't a routine in place, and an actually good working routine in place, and the students have it down and you have it down, then you may also be dealing with behaviors, because there's space and freedom for students to try different things, to have different expectations for themselves than those that were set up. Now, there's also instructional factors. Those more related to task difficulty, clarity, and pace. Something like, is the task that you assign the students too hard, too easy? Are the directions confusing? And is the pacing right? So if we give students a worksheet and we just did a whole lesson, but the worksheet is like 2 lessons ahead of where you are in what you just did with your students, it is too hard, and you might have students who react to that quite differently. Some people give up, some people constantly raise their hand, they're asking for help. Some students are going to be just pretending they know it all. I'm just going to try to fill something out because that's how they're behaving. Um, the same thing might happen when something is too easy. When we plan for things and you're like, this activity is going to take us so much longer to do. And turns out it was actually really easy. And now you're just waiting for one student to finish and everybody else is having some kind of, everybody's talking and it's getting louder and it's getting messier. And that's the one student is now out of their desk. And what do you do? That is also part of instructional factors. When the directions are confusing, when they're just not clear, they should be A, B, C, D, not A plus B plus B plus C plus. We need to have very, very simple directions. And is the pacing right? Did I give students enough time to get things done? Did I give students too much time to get things done? How do we adjust for these things? Those all make a difference with instructional factors. Social factors, we're looking at peer relationships, expectations, transitions. Is there peer pressure? Is the student trying to connect or avoid some sort of interaction? Are they doing well when there are transitions that also involve so many other students and like social parts? So let's say going from class time to gym time, the students get super excited and they're now able to run around and kind of release some energy. Is the social factor of I got to impress my peers there. I want to avoid being called out to get on a team. There's lots of happening that could be socially that could be affecting behavior. And then we're also going to look at biological and emotional states. And this is some of the bigger underlying causes for when students typically may come in with behaviors into your classroom. Like the day just started and your student is having like an attitude already. And you're like, we just said hello. What is happening? It could be bigger issues, things like hunger and trauma, and maybe an actual characteristic of an individual's disability. Maybe it's anxiety or stress related. Do they have a headache? Did they get enough sleep last night? There's a lot that can go in there, and those are some of the bigger or underlying factors that can affect behavior as well. So all of these pieces, and there are also different ones, we can categorize them and label them many different ways, but just giving us an idea that, again, behavior isn't random. Behavior is going to be shaped by many different aspects and factors that all people come across every day. And they're going to also, for our students, they're going to shape how our students show up and how they behave. And often what looks like misbehavior is really a student trying to cope the only way that they know how. So I mentioned in our objectives that we are going to try to dispel some myths. One of the biggest ones that we are going to look at is that, especially one that I hope everybody walks away with, is a shift in your mindset that behavior is not about morality. Behavior does not equal morality. For those of us who have been working with students for a long time or for any amount of time, really, we might come to find this quite quickly or quite naturally. Like, we'll understand, Jamie is mad because today they were kicked out of the friend group for whatever reason. And that they're behaving towards you is in a reaction of, not necessarily because of because they have bad morals, not because they're bad people in any way. When we start to describe students as bad or manipulative or disrespectful, we are making value judgments that don't help us understand or support that student. And more often than not, those labels are going to disproportionately get applied to students with disabilities, students of color, students from marginalized communities. When you really get down to it, those labels, bad, manipulative, disrespectful, lazy, they are really going to be applied to students who don't just generally fit the majority of the population, who don't fit that norm. We're going to shift from the idea of thinking that behavior is some sort of internal morality structure when it's not. Is not that. So we're moving away from that, and we're going to try to be our best about being cognizant about using those descriptors when speaking about students' behaviors. All right, so we're going to revisit those same examples from just earlier. We're going to give them a little bit more emphasis here. When we are looking at a mild, moderate support needs student, we have Allie. She's a fourth grader with ADHD, frequently gets up and paces the room. So instead of a teacher saying that they're not listening and they're not doing what they're supposed to do, try to shift or reframe that idea into just the behavior. Allie is engaging with the lesson to some degree, but they are struggling with impulse control. So for a student with extensive support needs, let's say we have Lewis, he's a non-speaking student with autism, and he bites his hands often during transition. Not an uncommon thing that you might see. Instead of saying that that student is kind of distracting or trying to get attention for biting their hands, which might be true, who knows, or being defiant, right? Because you told all your students to have their hands at their sides as we walk over to transition to the next activity. We might have to reframe this behavior and say, is this task overwhelming? Does Lewis know to ask for a break, or do we have some sort of system in place that's going to help Lewis feel like the transition does not need to make them stressed out or feel any specific way where they have to then bite their hand to get comfort, or to like kind of manage through that situation? Because students are biting their hands, there's a chance that they might hurt themselves. We don't want that, certainly. And we wouldn't say that they're doing this so that you can get in trouble for them biting themselves. Like we're not going in that way. So a teacher might be concerned, but unsure of how to respond. And part of that is that we need to, again, reframe that behavior into seeing why something might be happening. So when we lead with curiosity, it's a little quote I have written here, we give ourselves and our students room to grow. Being curious is probably the best descriptor there that I can give you. Let's be curious instead of judgmental. So we're going to do a quick check on what is behavior. I'm going to read some statements, and I want you to complete the puzzle questions and say whether or not the statements are behaviors. And just remember, if you can observe it and measure it, it is a behavior. The first one, rolling your eyes, refusing to do a worksheet, being disrespectful, laughing loudly during a lesson, getting frustrated, being lazy. For the first one, rolling your eyes, yes, that's observable. I can see it happening, and I can see it happening every time I mention doing science hour. Student hates science, they're going to roll their eyes at me every time. Refusing to do a worksheet. Yeah, that is an observable thing. The student pushed the worksheet away from me. The student was told multiple times, make sure to get your worksheet done, and they refused to do it. Being disrespectful. No, that is an interpretation of a behavior. A student being disrespectful requires far more information for us. In what ways? How do you mean? What did they do? What did they say? For us to understand that they were being disrespectful. However, we're defining disrespect, but we need to get down to the actual behavior that led you to think it was disrespect. Laughing loudly during a lesson. Yes, you're teaching, you hear it. It keeps happening because the students ask you for attention, or talking with another friend and not paying attention. That is a behavior we observe. Getting frustrated. Getting frustrated is not a behavior. It is a description of a behavior that's happening. The student is frustrated. How do I know that? Because they're pushing those papers off their desk. They flipped over their desk. They put their head down when it was time for the math lesson, when it was time to read, because that's the one that they don't like to do. They get frustrated when they do it, or they even attempt it. Being lazy. Again, no, that is a label. It is not a behavior. How do we define being lazy? They came into class and they slumped on their chairs and they're not paying attention. And there's lots of different things that we can describe as being lazy. All they did was like 3 problems, even though they got those all right. And they needed to do all 10 of them to get the grade for class. Like that is what we might describe a label as being lazy, but we need to define that behavior better. I hope this helps understand the difference a little bit. Again, we're looking at what the actual behavior is, not what the label or description of it that we might give. So I'm going to say this again and again and again, because it's the heartbeat of this course, essentially. Behavior is communication. Behavior is communication. It's how students tell us what they need and what they're struggling with and where they need support. Our job isn't to punish behavior. Our job is to understand it, so that we can teach more appropriate, functional, socially acceptable ways to meet those needs. I'm also going to put a little caveat there. Punishment in this sense is, it doesn't mean that we're never going to call students out for their behaviors. It doesn't mean that we're never going to address those behaviors directly and students have to have consequences for their behaviors. But we're going to to do is understand the behavior and then choose the appropriate ways to support the students from either improving those behaviors, stopping those from happening, however it may come to be. But we're not quite going to punish them for having behaviors if they're also trying to communicate something to us. And when we do this, we really start to build classrooms that feel safer and calmer and more connected for everyone. And hopefully for you too, as the teacher, that getting down to addressing specific behaviors with students, hopefully you will find to be much more useful a practice for yourself than punishing all negative behaviors that you've seen or that you're interacting with. So this was segment 1. And before we move on to segment 2, I want to leave you with this quick activity to think about. I want you to think of a student behavior or person's behavior that has frustrated you. And I want you to, now that you have reframed your understanding of behavior, I want you to ask yourself, what might that person's behavior have been communicating? If you got in a fight with your partner or your child or your neighbor, and you don't really even know how it happened, but something happened, and you guys started fighting about it, what was actually being communicated? Did you know what was being communicated? There might be underlying reasons that you have no clue or insight into, depending on the situation. Now that you have a little bit of understanding of reframing your understanding of behavior, is there anything that you would do differently to address that big situation that you have in mind? All right, so here in section 2, we're looking at functions of behavior and reinforcement. In our first segment there, we talked about what behavior is and our mindsets about behavior, and understanding that our mindsets about behavior can either help us or hold us and our students back. In this segment, part 2, we're going to take a step further and we're going to talk about why behavior happens. Because again, behavior is never random. By the end of this section here, you'll be able to use the ABC model, and we're going to go over that. It's a 3-part behavioral model called antecedent, behavior, consequence, or ABC. We're going to be able to understand and describe the 4 functions of behavior, and we're going to begin thinking about reinforcement. What is it really, and how can it shape behavior? And of course, we're going to look at some classroom examples along the way. So we're going to start off with something that you'll hear a lot in the world of behavior modification, behavior supports. It stems from the world of applied behavior analysis, or ABA, and it is called the ABC model. This stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. The antecedent is going to be what happens before the behavior occurs. The behavior is going to be that middle part, the actual behavior that happened. It's observable because you saw it. And the C for consequence is going to be what happens after the behavior. Now, when we talk about consequence, we don't mean punishment. We are looking more at an if-then example. So if A happened, B occurred, then C happened after. So it's more of like it's literally A plus B equals C situation, but if then, first and second and third kind of situation. I want you to think of them as steps, because when we look at consequence, it's not necessarily a punishment term. It is just what happened once the behavior occurred. So we're going to look at an example. So antecedent, a student is given a writing worksheet. That's the first thing that happened. You gave your student a writing worksheet. Behavior. Immediately after that, your student crumbles it up and throws it away. Throws it across the classroom, crumples up that worksheet, throws it across the classroom. Consequence. The teacher takes away that worksheet, is not really going to address it, and gives the student a different worksheet completely. And it's like a color in worksheet, and they just color in for the rest of the class. What do you think the student learned there? Likely, if I throw the worksheet, I don't have to do work and I can just color. I don't have to do any of that writing. Writing sucks. I don't have to do that. If I just do this, my teacher doesn't want to deal with it. They're just going to give me an easy coloring assignment. And that's what I wanted to do anyways. That's an example of a behavior being reinforced, even unintentionally, even if it's sometimes like you've had enough and this has been a really long, hard day and you can't deal with this kid throwing another paper in your classroom. So you're not going to fight that fight today. You're going to give them a coloring sheet instead. And even though it's not something you are intentionally trying to do, we are also in this moment reinforcing to our students that their behavior, that crumpling, that throwing away the sheet, is a perfectly acceptable way to deal with the antecedent, with getting that worksheet, because that way they can get out of it. They don't have to do it again. So we're also going to be looking at reinforcements. Well, what are we reinforcing when we're doing this with our students? Okay, so we're going to pause here and apply this model to our own experiences, the ABC model. So I want you to think of a behavior that you've seen a student engage in. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a student. It could be someone you've recently had an interaction with. And it should be a behavior that either confused you or frustrated you or like just had you questioning things. And I want you to try to figure out what the ABCs were of that specific behavior. So for the antecedent, what triggered the behavior? What happened immediately before the behavior that may have been triggering? What was the actual behavior that the person engaged in? And then see for consequence, what happened right after? So here's honestly the big idea. And we've said it again, no behavior is random, but all behavior has a purpose. All behavior serves a purpose. And that purpose, or what we're going to call function, so function is the same thing as purpose, usually is going to fall into one of four categories, meaning that there are four primary functions of behavior. I'm going to put a little asterisk on this for you. If anybody is in the world of applied behavior analysis, ABA, really delving into behavior as a whole specialty area, you will come to find that these four functions really can be split up and talked about many different ways, and it kind of comes out to more than four. For the purposes of our classroom, and because we're not a behavior-based program like that, we're not training you to be behaviorists, we are going to kind of put them all in as the four primary functions. And this is a very common way to look at that, but just for any of those of you who might be really into this world of behavior, know that it can expand far more than this. Okay, so there are four primary functions of behavior, and this is going to be true of all grade levels, all abilities, all settings, all people. This does not apply solely to students with disabilities. This does not apply solely to just students or a specific age group. This is literally for every single human being. We can kind of put down why their behavior exists within one of four, or sometimes more than one of four primary functions. All right, so the first one is attention, and it means getting interaction from adults or peers. The next is escape or avoidance, which means getting out of a demand or a situation. We're trying to escape something. We don't want to do this thing. The other is access to tangibles, getting something desirable. A tangible is literally anything I can like hold or have or touch or use or want. It's a toy, a snack, a preferred activity. And the final one, and one that people don't tend to see as often, but definitely does exist, especially with students who have more extensive support needs, is our sensory automatic function. Usually now we'll just call it sensory, but again, you might come across it being called automatic because it happens sometimes. And that means that the behavior that person is engaging in is either like pleasurable or calming or really needed for them internally for whatever reason. So let's look at just function number one, which is attention. So some students engage in behaviors to get attention, and that attention may be from you, a peer, the whole class. Think about students who makes jokes throughout the lesson, one who's constantly trying to talk to peers, even though they're supposed to be working, one that is making silly noises. Somebody's doing something that at their desk, and suddenly all the students are kind of turning around and paying attention to them instead of what's happening at the front of the classroom or within their own work. These are all attention-based behaviors. And it's not always about being disruptive. It's usually about connection. The students, people, humans want attention in some form or fashion sometimes. They just do. And for others, we will learn that attention can be positive or negative, but it's kind of like that paparazzi saying like all media exposure is like good media because at least your name is out there kind of situation. That's very similar to attention. If a student just wants attention, it doesn't really matter that they got it from being an A+ student and always raising their hand and being very nice and being this wonderful example model student. That's one way to get attention, and that could be a very positive thing, right? In many eyes. But then there's also the student who is throwing a tantrum every day, who is screaming, is making jokes, is laughing, is crying, is doing lots of different things that are calling for your attention. And even though it's negative attention is still attention. Even though they're getting in trouble and having to be sent to the principal's office, it's attention. That's what they wanted, attention. So when they're being scolded or redirected, we are reinforcing the behavior of attention for students, especially if they're craving this interaction. Think about a situation where a kid has like 7 siblings at home and they don't get any attention because they got 7 siblings at home and there's a lot going on and they're just not top dog at the house situation right now. When they come to class and they're the class clown and they're the ones who are always kind of like derailing your day. And it's not that they're a bad student in any way. It's just that they're always moving your day around in a place you didn't really mean for it. And now you guys are off topic and now this is happening. This is it's giving that student the attention that they're craving, but it's also moving you away from what you needed to do as a teacher, as your job kind of demands for you to do, teach and work with your students. And sometimes it's not that big of a deal. We can kind of easily make some movements. And other times the attention crave or attention to behaviors are really intense with some students, and we need to think about them pretty deeply. All right, second, we have escape or avoidance. So this is when a student is engaging in a behavior to get out of something. So maybe a task is hard, maybe they're anxious, maybe they're tired. And so they're going to act out, they're going to shut down, they're going to leave the area because it gives them relief to do that. It means that they don't have to do the thing that was being asked of in the first place. So let's go back to a classroom example. We're engaging in some math lessons here with the student, and they recognize that these are our math folders. These are the colors we use when we go into math. And I set it right in front of my student, and all of a sudden it's really pushing that thing away. Or now I have a student who eloped and ran out of the classroom. They look at the type of math I gave them, and it's not addition that they really like. It's actually subtraction, and it has more than those 2 numbers that they're used to. And this task is too hard, or quote unquote, too hard for them right now. And so they are going to start screaming and banging their head and their fists and everything, because you have to deal with that immediate behavior, the screaming, the banging their head, their fists, because if you don't, it's derailing everything. It's distracting everybody, but also the student can get hurt if they're engaging in this behavior. And they do this behavior so that they don't have to do that math, or they don't have to do whatever task it is you assign them. For those of you who are parents, maybe you asked your children to do the dishes, clean their room, do something right around the house. And all of a sudden, they're so sick. They're so sick and they're crying because whatever happened, and they're cranky and everything. And you just give them a break and you're like, fine, go lay down instead. You don't have to do the dishes. That's them escaping the task. Using their behavior. They're using escape to get out of what it is that they don't want to do. It's not always that serious of a case. I don't think people are generally trying to manipulate you. It's something that kind of happens. We're human. We're like, oh, that sounds really hard. I don't want to do that. And we avoid it or we escape it. But as we get older as adults, we may also see this as like just continued avoidance. We're just going to keep walking past something, pretending it doesn't exist. And it's our continued avoidance to escape having to do those dishes that have been sitting in the sink, or having to do the laundry that's been, literally sitting behind me for over a week now. This is, again, common for students who have mild, moderate, and extensive support needs. So a student with a learning disability might avoid reading out loud in class by having all of a sudden it's out loud reading time. They have to go to the bathroom every single time. They just have to go to the bathroom, and they don't come back really until the end of the reading. So they missed the reading, but also they didn't have to read out loud. They escaped the task they didn't want to do. A student with autism might run from the classroom when a transition is coming because they don't actually want to leave your classroom. They want to stay here at specials and do art and art and art, and they love art. But again, it's where their body and their brain is thinking, I don't want to go back to my main class. I'm just going to run away in general, like run. I'm going to run. And then you got to go chase them. I mean, don't chase students like that, but then you got to go find your students, and it becomes 30 minutes have gone by and they didn't have to go do that next thing at math in their regular classroom that they don't want to do anyways. So again, we need to understand the why before we can support the how. I'm going to say that the majority of classroom-based behaviors that we see are really going to fall into attention and escape. And now, more than before, I will also say tangibles, something we're seeing a lot more. And I'm kind of thinking a lot more tangible related to technology, but we'll get there. Function number 3 is access to tangibles. And tangibles are those things that we want. We literally want these things. It doesn't matter what the thing is. It means that the thing is that we want it. But this means that the behavior that the person is engaging in is a way to get something. It's a way for them to get a toy, a snack, a tablet, to get access to the preferred activity. That is what is driving their behavior. So you might see this when a student demands that they get their turn early, right? Everybody's taking turns with this toy here, this little bear. It's the share bear in class. Everybody gets a turn today. And you're gonna start seeing your student, or a student, crying and following around anyone who has the bear and maybe bullying them or pushing them or intimidating them or just straight stealing it from them. That behavior is driven by the want of that tangible item. It's the same thing about a student who throws a fit when that item is taken away. It's not your turn to have this share bear right now. We need to take it back. Now the fit that they throw, the behaviors of throwing themselves on the ground and stomping the floor and crying, or they put their head down, you can't get them to talk anymore for the rest of the day. That is a behavior that's occurring because the tangible was taken away. Same thing that can happen when the behavior is happening because they really want that tangible, and we want them to stop throwing their heads and their bodies all over the floor. And so, fine, you can have the bear back. When we give them access to that tangible, even if it's like accidentally, even if it's technically for their own good, to stop doing some horrible, like stop hurting themselves or stop distracting or whatever it may be, we are reinforcing that behavior is okay. Them throwing themselves all over the place and screaming and taking toys away from others, we're reinforcing that it's okay to do that, because at the end of the day, they end up with the thing that they wanted. The reason I say that I see this happening more, or I feel like tangible is something that is a primary function that we are seeing kind of cited a lot more, is because of, I think, technology. This is my personal little caveat in here. It's not 100% true in any way, but we do see young students, very young students, having the big love. I don't know if we want to call it addiction quite yet, but a big love for their tablets, their iPads. And they come into schools and they want tablet time or computer time or tablet time or tablet, like they want their iPad time. And that is a prize you get after a week of doing something, but that's also the only thing that they want. And they're going to be crying and screaming and behaving any sort of way if it means that they get that tablet time. We can also try to move our students over to behave a very specific way, and you will earn your tablet time. But sometimes we need to work on that like length of waiting period for students. And that's, especially when it comes to a tangible, length of waiting period tends to be really important. All right, function number 4 here is going to be sensory or automatic. So sensory automatic behaviors, these are behaviors that feel good, or they're going to help a person regulate. And they are not socially mediated, meaning that it's not like, this means that they're not getting something from another person by engaging in this behavior. So some examples that we see are going to be, that we see often, I guess, in schools, is like rocking back and forth, flapping hands, humming to yourself, covering their ears, tapping, very repetitive movements, shaking your legs so much that it's like making noise or something like that. These are all sensory based behaviors, meaning that engaging in them is doing something for me, but it has really nothing to do with like, because another student has a toy, because I'm not getting attention right now, because I want to get away from doing something. But this is helping regulate my personal internal feelings. If I'm really, really anxious and I have a pen, a clicky pen, I'm going to click that pen a million times because it's, I don't know why, it's making me feel better. I have plenty of students when I worked in more significant needs classrooms who would do a lot of rocking back and forth and like humming to themselves simultaneously, a lot of hand flapping, a lot of covering ears and humming, meaning that they don't know how loud they are. So it's like quite loud, or singing or speaking. And these are sensory related. They're trying to kind of navigate whatever sensor overload in sensory is by self-soothing. These are kind of self-soothing, self-regulating internal ways to do this that kind of happen very automatically, again, for people. So one really important thing is to note that sensory behaviors are not bad, but we may need to teach students when those behaviors are appropriate or provide alternative ways to meet the same need. I think what you might come across, especially those of you who are working with more students who are on the extensive support needs side, let's say you have a student who's like a hand biter, an arm biter, because for whatever reason, this is bringing them some sort of like regulation. It makes them feel better. in whatever moments of the day that are high stress inducing, anxiety inducing. Although this helps the student, when that behavior is not appropriate for the moment or that behavior is not safe, right? Then we need to figure out something that is going to help them meet that sensory need, but in a different way. All right, so here's some examples we're going to look at. The first two are going to be for students with mild, moderate support needs. The first behavior, a student blurts out answers in class without raising their hand. What function do you think this is? The second example, a student puts their head down when handed a writing assignment. What function do you think this is? Can you think of a student who you worked with who's shown similar behaviors? Or yourself, maybe in classrooms, have you shown similar behaviors? For the first one, when a student is blurting out answers without raising their hand, the most possible function that kind of comes to mind immediately is going to be attention. They want attention from either their teacher or peers. It doesn't really matter if the answer that the student has is right or wrong. It matters that they are purposely or just continuously blurting out the answer, because that gets everybody to either pay attention to them, for the teacher to say, yes, good job, next time raise your hand. Whatever the situation may be, they're getting attention. Everybody's laughing because they said a funny answer. In the second example, a student puts their head down when handed a writing example or a writing assignment. The possible function here is going to be escape. They don't either want to write, they think this task is too hard, they hate writing. They wrote yesterday. Why do they have to write today? They're just going to put their head down instead. They're escaping the task by engaging in the behavior of putting their head down. Now let's look at some examples for students who have more extensive support needs. First, we have a student, a nonverbal student, rocks back and forth and hums during transitions. And in the second example, a student pushes materials off their desk when given a math worksheet. All right. So for the first example, the nonverbal student rocking back and forth, it's likely to be sensory. They're either calming or self-regulating by rocking back and forth and humming during that transition time, because there may be a lot going on during transition time. It could be 7 different classes transitioning at the exact same time in the hallway, and this is a lot for them. So they're just going to start rocking back and forth while somebody helps them kind of get to where they need to go. In the second example, when a student pushes off their materials off their desk when given a math worksheet, this could really be one of two. So if you chose either of these, you could be correct. We need more details and information. But the first one being escape. Student pushes materials off their desk because they don't want to do this. Push that off their desk. It's not on their desk anymore. They don't have to, right? Or I'm going to push this off my desk and cry until somebody lets me just have my iPad time. Because when I push this off the desk, everybody knows it's about to go down. Just give the kid the iPad. Maybe they want access to preferred activity instead. All right, so we've looked at the force functions there. I want to talk about reinforcement. I've kind of started bringing up the word reinforcement a little bit, but this is a really, really big concept when it comes to behavior support, and one that is often going to be really misunderstood. The world of reinforcement, you can go down a giant rabbit hole here, and I'm trying my best to keep it as simple an idea as possible for us to understand here within our given time. So reinforcement is going to be anything that increases the likelihood of a behavior happening again. And that's it. It's going to simply increase the likelihood that a behavior will happen again. If you give praise and the behavior increases, that's reinforcement. A student raised their hand and answered a question correctly. You say, great job, Belkis, you raised your hand and you answered correctly. It's going to reinforce me to raise my hand again next time when I have a correct answer to share. It's gonna keep giving me that great reinforcement, right? To keep doing this behavior. It's going to increase the likelihood of it. There is such a thing as positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And they kind of take a slightly different turn than something being good or bad. That positive and negative in the terms in the world of reinforcement don't mean good or bad. A positive means that we are adding something to the scenario that is going to increase the likelihood of that behavior happening again. A negative reinforcer is that we're going to take something away that is going to increase the likelihood of that behavior happening again. So when let's look at a positive reinforcement scenario. I had a student Oswald, who was only doing like 2 questions in their whole worksheet, because then they get out of task and they start doing something else. And we tell Oswald, we got a little sticker chart right on Oswald's desk. And every time they get through the whole worksheet and they do it with, fidelity, and we talked about what all that means, they're going to get a sticker. And if they get 3 stickers by the end of the day, they can get something from the treasure chest. That is adding something to the situation that is going to increase the likelihood that Oswald's actually going to get through all of their work. And it's going to positively reinforce them. We're adding something in there. We are adding the treasure chest sticker system to increase the likelihood that Oswald's going to finish all their assignments, all of their worksheets. They're going to do them all. But when it's a negative reinforcement, we're removing something unpleasant, right? So let's say that the reason we have a student who's out of task behavior is because they hate sitting next to that student during this class time. They hate sitting next to that student because maybe that student works so fast and gets them all right that it's like too much for them, and they feel bad about not being able to do the same kind of work. And so instead they're going to engage in out of task behaviors, right? And when we start to remove those situations, we're going to remove you from this specific setting. And during this time in class, you can actually go sit at the teacher's desk. We're going to remove you from this setting. I'm going to sit you somewhere else that maybe makes you feel happier in general. And it's going to increase the chance of you being able to, that student being able to actually complete all of their work, or to finish the task that they were given, and instead of walking around and talking to other people and going to sharpen their pencil and stretching and maybe looking at their book bag for 20 minutes, by removing either something from that environment, by removing the number of problems on a worksheet from instead of 10 to 5, and we'll work our way up eventually, that might be a way to increase the likeliness that the behavior is going to happen again. The behavior being, we want you to get that thing done. So both of these, positive and negative, can strengthen behavior. Again, it's not about good or bad. It's literally going to be about what works in that moment. So when we are positively reinforcing something, it means that we are adding something to the mix. And if we're negatively reinforcing something, it means we're removing something from this equation. And both of these are going to lead to the same outcome, increased likelihood that a behavior is going to happen. We are also going to clear up a misconception here. Reinforcement is not bribery. Reinforcement is not bribery. Let's put that out very, very, very specifically, because critics of the world of behavior analysis, and there are many, and it's pro and cons to many things here, but because these ideas are coming from the world of behavior analysis, we also need to acknowledge that there is a perception that reinforcing students' behavior is a way to also bribe them. By giving them this candy, we're reinforcing them to complete this work only if they get candy out of it. But that's not quite the same thing. We're adding in different elements here. We're not bribing students. We're trying to find what we either need to add or remove from the situation that's going to get our student to do that behavior. All right. So we're going to do a little quick pause and check. Is it reinforcement? So in scenario 1 here, a teacher gives a sticker every time a student stays seated during morning meeting. Is it reinforcement? And is it positive or negative? Scenario 2, a teacher ignores a student when they shout and the shouting stops over time. Is it reinforcement? Sorry. In the very first scenario here, we have a teacher gives a sticker every time a student stays seated during morning meeting. Yes, this is reinforcement, because we are adding something to the situation, so meaning it's positive. We're giving a sticker. And because we're giving a sticker, the student is going to, we're increasing the likelihood of that student staying seated during that morning meeting. Now, scenario number 2 was a tricky one. A teacher ignores a student when they shout and the shouting stops over time. So in this scenario here, nothing was either given or taken away. So actually it's not reinforcement. This is something called extinction. We are extinguishing the behavior completely by ignoring. Ignoring it is a very, very useful tactic for many different ways. But by ignoring a behavior, we are not either giving something or adding something to it. Reinforcement is only going to count, is only going to be true if it's increasing the behavior. So if by ignoring a student when they shout and the shouting never stopped and it just gets worse and worse and worse, then that is actually reinforcing the behavior. However, by ignoring the student and the shouting stops over time, that's not reinforcement because nothing is increasing behavior here. So when we shift our mindsets, again, from how do I stop this to what is the student trying to get or avoid or communicate with me, we open a door to compassion and far more like we swing that door open into effective support. Because when we are understanding that behavior is serving a purpose, even when it looks disruptive or inappropriate, it is telling us something important. So here's what you definitely need to remember. All behavior serves a function. There are 4 primary functions to behavior. And when you understand this, everything starts to make more sense. Again, with a little caveat, just because it makes more sense does not mean that it makes it less frustrating or difficult to deal with as teachers, but it gives us some better insight into why something is happening. And if we can understand the why, then we have a better chance of attacking the how. So instead of thinking that the student is being difficult, I want you to start asking, what is it they're trying to get or avoid? What is it that they are trying to just tell me in general? And that shift from judgment to understanding is really going to open that door open for finding the correct supports for our students. All right, everybody, we are moving on to part 3 here, and this is going to be an introduction to positive behavior interventions and supports, or PBIS. We will come across PBIS is probably how we're going to call it quite often in school settings and within this course, certainly, because PBIS is a kind of standing essential framework for understanding and supporting student behavior at both the school and the classroom level. It is in practice in so many different schools and classrooms throughout the country. It's kind of where the shift towards working with and addressing behavior have been. So we're going to start with what is PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports. So PBIS is an evidence-based tiered framework that supports students' behavioral, academic, social, and emotional and mental health. So PBIS, instead of focusing on punishment, it builds positive, predictable, equitable, safe learning environments where everyone thrives. What I'm going to note here is that the way I describe PBIS in these slides is PBIS the way it's supposed to be. The reason I say that is because there is a lot in theory that doesn't always translate in practice the same way, and for lots of different reasons. And we'll talk about these as we go on, but know that the way I'm describing them here, the way that PBIS is designed to work is in its most like, here's what it's supposed to do. It's been proven to do this if you do it exactly how we say. However, when schools take on PBIS models, they have to adjust it to their school environment, to their specific student population, to lots of different things happening. And if you don't do all of it the right way with fidelity, then you're not always going to get a PBIS model or PBIS like support system or behavioral support system in your schools that works the way that it's going to be explained and intended here. So just keep in mind, it comes with a caveat the way we talk about PBIS. But either way, why do we need positive behavior support? So for a majority of time in education, many schools, the go-to response for behavior was punishment. And punishment was referring to, in this case, detention, loss of privileges, suspensions. You can't go on that field trip. But research is going to tell us, it has told us, and you can tell yourselves this from being in classes with students for a week at a time of your life, maybe punishment does not teach. Punishment may work in certain cases to stop something from happening, right? However, it doesn't teach. And the majority of your time in your classrooms, you're teaching. You're supposed to be teaching. And punishment, just continuous punishment on students is not going to be how they got taught. It doesn't teach them what it is you want them to get out of the like changing your behavior. PBIS instead is going to help shift our focus from what's wrong with the student to what supports the student or the class or the school need to succeed. PBIS is intended to support all students, including those at risk. It's intended to improve school climate, mental wellness, behavior outcomes. It's supposed to reduce reliance on punitive measures while increasing instructional time and belonging. Again, in its most idyllic sense, it's supposed to do all of this. It is not a feel-good based approach. It is very much rooted in behavioral sciences and like proven to have direct effect on behavior for schools and classrooms when again done in their very specific outlined manner. Because if it's rooted in social sciences, it means that or behavioral sciences, excuse me, it means that the world of PBIS comes with, think of it like a science experiment. There are it's very specific steps that we have to take. We have to take A, B, C, D, E, F, G's, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps in order to see this experiment through. And we might adjust certain variables, but it's a very procedural process. And the PBIS is very honestly quite procedural in that way as well. The thing about PBIS is that it also hinges on the human element, factors, us, students, administrators, buildings, parents, and it puts a lot on the human where maybe a science experiment does not quite in that same manner. So PBIS have 5 key elements: systems, data, practices, and outcomes. First, systems. These are the structures that schools put into place, like your leadership teams, your coaching supports, your built-in professional developments. These structures are supposed to be making PBIS more than just a poster on the wall. It's not just saying, hey guys, we're doing PBIS. Here's what it looks like. Follow the graph. Not at all. Everyone is supposed to be in on this system. So when schools build strong systems, they make it easier for educators to implement and sustain behavior practices. And that is honestly going to be true of any kind of school system, right? Next is going to be data. And PBIS, again, not a feel-good model. It's not a guesswork model. It is a data evidence-based model. Data is going to guide decisions at every level. Working in schools, you're going to hear the words data, data, data 1,000 million times to the point where it becomes like a nonsensical word to you. When we're looking at positive behavioral supports, data actually makes a huge difference, because whether we're looking at school-wide patterns or an individual's behavior, we need data to understand what's happening, what's working, and what needs adjustment. So if we think back to those the functions of behavior, and just describing behavior of a student, just saying a student is always at a seat really doesn't mean anything. What does always mean? How often does it happen? Does it happen very specific time of day? Does it happen anytime work is given? Does it happen? We need that specific data. We need to know how often it happens, how long it happens, when it happens, in order for us to make decisions about what we need to adjust or change or to do to support that student for being in their seat. Then we have practice, and these are going to be the actual strategies you use in your classroom. They should always be evidence-based strategies, and they should always be matched to your students' needs. So as an example, teaching expected behaviors, and not just saying, the expected behavior is that we're always going to talk at a level 2 in this classroom. What does a level 2 sound like? What does a level 2 sound like versus a level 1 versus a level 5? We have to understand all of those, practice those behaviors that we want out of our students. We're teaching expected behaviors. We are reinforcing participation into those behaviors. And we're going to use restorative check-ins instead of punishments to have all of our students fall under this new practice that we're using. So a restorative check-in in this situation would be a redirection of your student. We're going to use our classroom-based system for addressing behaviors. We might give a warning to a student and bring them back into, this is the behavior we're doing, and reinforcing them when they actually do the behavior. Our outcomes are going to be our goals. So PBIS is not simply about reducing like office referrals, which, I mean, great, right? We don't want to have to keep sending students to the office, and we don't want to have to keep sending people to restorative detention, whatever they want to call it. PBIS is essentially at its heart about creating a safe, inclusive, academically rich environment where all students are going to thrive. And there's a big emphasis on the all students are going to thrive. And we'll see kind of an example of that in the coming slides. The outcomes should be clearly defined and measurable. We are going to be experts in writing outcomes for our students with our IEPs, with our lesson plans, because an outcome is the exact same thing as an objective. What is the end goal? That's our outcome. How do we get there? And the end goal could be behavioral, it could be academic, it could be social, it could be emotional, it could be so many different things, right? It's backwards planning. And finally, there's equity. And equity in the PBIS model is not an add-on. Equity is embedded in all elements of the PBIS framework. So it's going to be embedded in systems and data and practices and outcomes. And this means that we are designing all of these supports to be culturally responsive, inclusive to all the students, accessible to all the students, And we are really putting in there that equity is an important piece of supporting all levels of accomplishments in schools, academic, behavior, social, emotional, so forth. So diving in a little bit deeper, we're going to look into systems first. I want you to think about a school's leadership team. If you have worked in a school, you can think of one that you've definitely worked in. And if not, maybe when you went to school yourselves, in that school's leadership team, is there someone who is focused on behavior and student wellness? So lots of schools now will have a student support team. They might call them slightly different things, but it's usually a team of educators that from different like departments and different grades, and includes leadership and teachers and staff and lots of different groups in the school. And they will come together on a regular basis and talk about students that they're concerned about and try to put in some interventions and supports that are going to help those students. This is also the beginning model or the beginning pieces of identifying students as potentially having disabilities or needing more supports because of a disability. Some schools, especially large campuses, might have a dean of behavior. There's a different word, a dean of discipline, a dean of behavior. And this might be the person who's leading the whole PBIS system. It could also be any admin person leading the system. It's almost always going to be, not almost always, it is likely to be an admin person dealing with kind of overseeing the whole behavioral system, but it could also really include and really be led by many different people at the school site. One of the questions to ask was, are general and special ed staff both present or both represented? And especially in these teams, you're going to want a diverse representation of people who understand different groups of students, certainly, and have exposure to different groups of students. So as an example, the last high school I worked in, it was a really big school. They had one principal and like 8 different vice principals because there's a lot going on. All the different groups needed a vice principal. Great. But because of that, it also meant that a lot of these vice principals, a lot of these school leadership had limited access to other groups of students because they're dealing with dealing with the group that they're assigned to deal with. But if we are having a PBIS student support team meeting kind of situation happening, I'm going to need people who also know the students we're talking about in there. All right. So PBIS systems include how coaching is provided, how staff are trained, and how leadership ensures everyone stays on the same page. These aren't meant to be one-off PDs. These are meant to be a year-long, long-term, sustainable structure that is built and refined and honed over years. Knowing that if your school, this is the first year or they've been doing PBIS for 3 years, there's still a ways to go, many things to learn, to fix, to do different. And nothing works perfectly the first time around, especially not a big system implementation. We're going to change completely how we've ever dealt with behavior from last year to this year. It's going to take a while to really hone in, and it means continuous PD, continuous work towards these goals. If you've ever felt like your school introduced a new initiative that fizzled out quickly, you're not alone in that boat at all. PBI systems are designed to prevent that from happening because they really do require sustained implementation over time. But again, this is going to come with the caveat, everyone needs to be on board to do that. All right, so now we're going to get into data. PBIS relies on daily data. We are talking discipline, behavior trends, screening. PBIS is going to encourage schools to use data, not just at IEP meetings, in everyday practices. This can include office discipline referrals, behavior incidence reports, attendance data, even things like teacher-created tools where you are yourself kind of tallying or tracking behaviors that are occurring in your classrooms. Importantly, data should be used proactively, not reactively, proactively. So instead of waiting for things to get bad, PBIS teams should be looking for early signs that students or groups of students might need additional supports. So the purpose of the student support teams that are happening in schools is to proactively put other interventions in place that are going to support those students, group of students, that classroom before it becomes an issue. Getting together as a PBIS team is not just looking at behavior. We're also looking at the academic parts, the social parts, all pieces here. Yes, disaggregating data by race, by language, by disability status, by sometimes even by gender, and whatever other bigger categorizations we can think of is going to be a key part of making sure that we are addressing disparities in discipline. So getting down into the nitty gritty, if I'm only bringing in data on behavior related issues and they all happen to be about the boys in my classroom, or they all happen to be about students of color. And actually, as kind of a practice we all got going on here is the majority of students we're bringing up are going to be students of color. And I bring this up as an example because it happens. It happens quite often, where, all of a sudden we only really find issues with, it happens more for males and it happens more for students of color, but we're only really finding these issues with these students. We're not really seeing these same issues with other students. And that might most likely is not true. But by disaggregating that data and looking at different, EL students, are looking at students with disabilities, looking at race and gender and all these different categories is really going to help us make sure that we are not either over or under identifying any group of students. We're not ignoring any group of students. We're looking at all of our group of students, and we're going to try to make sure that we are not disciplining or putting on consequences on specific groups because of some internalized issues that we may also need to address. And that's going to have to go into our PBIS trainings. So, practices. What kind of practices actually fall under PBIS? Well, some of them are probably things that you're already doing. It happen very naturally in most schools, especially in the first couple of weeks of schools, first couple of months. You are setting expectations. You are modeling routines. You're using praise very intentionally. Great job. I see that you're doing that really well. It's a huge improvement. Written praise, verbal praise, encouraging inner group praise, doing it all with intention. And following through with consequences is consistency. Again, good consequences, bad consequences. If I promised my class a pizza party and they met the requirement to get that pizza party, I have to give them a pizza party. I promise them, right? I'm not going to make promises I'm not keeping, especially to children, because they will remember and they will not continue working towards things if we take away the things that we promised, right? But the same being for consequences of but related more to those of punishment. We said you couldn't go on that field trip if you didn't raise your math grade to a C, because only students who are passing can go on this. It doesn't mean that we're going to cave in and let them go on that field trip because we felt bad or because their mom came and yelled or whatever. We are following through with our consequences. Consistency is a very, very huge thing in the world of PBIS. And honestly, in any world here, it's big. So these are one of our practices, certainly. The key difference with practices that are already happening and practices in PBIS is that the ones that we are using in the world of PBIS are going to be selected very intentionally. And they're almost always going to be grounded in evidence, meaning we're not really going to test out these like experimental kind of practices here. We are going to use practices that are going to help us be very explicit, that are explicit in the way that we can exactly define what this looks like. When we say we give praise to our students, when we give praise, it's going to include verbal praise for, and we're going to specify exactly what for. We're going to give written praise on feedback or homework assignments or whatever for, and we're going to say exactly what that praise is going to be for. Did you get it done? Did you get them right? What are we giving praise for? We are going to be doing things with very explicit preciseness in this world when we are looking at what strategies to use. We are also looking at documentation of methods and outcomes. Not just we're putting this practice into place, we are putting this practice into place and we're going to document whether or not that's working. We're going to specify exactly what the practice is. We can define it. We can break it down to different categories. And we are then going to document data, take that data, take that observational information, write it down, put it down, and see how they're all connected. When I say we are doing precise definitions about teaching expectations, providing praise, offering visual supports, then I also need to give those actual examples of what that means and what the expected outcomes are going to be. And then with your data, what the actual outcomes are. By being this explicit, by being this precise, and nitpicky if you want to call it that, by being like this, it means that, let's say I do all of this work and I have it written down and I share it with another teacher, a substitute who comes into my classroom, who's going to be there for the long term because I got to go on leave for a bit. The goal of it being, I should be able to give you this exact information and you should be able to understand exactly what to do because I've precisely defined it. I've given you examples. We know that these practices are chosen for a specific reason, and we know that they're backed by evidence in some sort of way. We should be able to translate this to everybody. Everybody should be able to get this one. Okay. When we talk about outcomes in PBIS, we are not just trying to reduce bad behaviors. We are focused on growth in behavior, social, emotional, and academic performance. Especially in the world of education, there is a big emphasis on deficit. And instead of being on deficit and on how much more our students have to go before they reach that point that they're supposed to get to, we're going to focus on growth in all aspects. And we do this by looking at goals. So each school or district has their own measurable goals, like increasing time spent in instruction instead of dealing with behavior, or increasing time spent actually teaching, improving school climate survey results, meaning that we are then really focused on schools climate, teachers feeling comfortable, students feeling comfortable, staff feeling comfortable, everybody feeling like this is a place where good things are happening. And we know this because we take a survey after everything, but we make it a goal to improve those things. We can also schools will also make goals like decreasing exclusionary discipline practice. So this is looking at like your discipline numbers, how many students are going to detention on a weekly basis. And when you break those down to race and language and disability categories, how many of the students have a disability, how many of the students are also EL learners, how many of the students are students of color, how many students are male. And we are trying to decrease any exclusionary practices that are kind of targeting or kind of specifically taking out these students here, these specific groups of people. So critically, the outcomes that we have, that we work on, should be defined with community input. This is really, really critical to the PBIS system. And this also, I will say, happens quite early in the PBIS planning of things. When your schools are first deciding, we're going to do PBIS, we have to create goals. This is going to happen kind of very early on, because the goals, if it's really important that we do it with community input, it means leadership doesn't make them by themselves. It means technically the school doesn't make them by themselves. It means leadership needs the input of all the teachers who are going to be doing it. It means the school needs the input of all the families. It means that if possible, we can also bring in students into this world and say, we are all going to create a goal. We all have to be on the same page here, because it's not solely about us. It's about everybody who's being affected in here. And finally, there's equity. I mentioned before, equity is at the heart of PBIS. And I meant that very sincerely when you look into exactly how PBIS is meant to be done, supposed to be done, the way that it's created and consistently revised and worked on. Too often, traditional discipline practices have disproportionately impacted students of color, English learners, students with disabilities, any students of minoritized population, LGBTQ students, students of low income. Lots of different groups can kind of fit into this, and they have been disproportionately impacted by discipline because they're not fitting in whatever the big norm is, but there are other factors to consider. PBIS will ask us to examine our data for bias. It's going to ask you to reflect on your practices. It's going to ask you to redesign systems that are going to then support all of your students. So keep all of them in mind as individual human beings within one setting and not as one giant group of kids, especially when we're looking at those who have been historically underserved. To do this, it's literally taking your data, taking all the stuff that you have available to you, and looking at, like, let's look at grades, just grades in general. Are we grading certain student groups worse, better, differently than others? When we look at discipline records, are we disciplining student groups worse, differently, better than other groups of students? And we're going to then reflect on practices like, why is that happening? Why is that making that happen? We might have to attack some internal things, some school-wide issues. But once we work on these things, and as we work on these things, we have to redesign our systems to make sure that we are reviewing information on a regular basis and ensuring that we're not doing things that are negatively impacting our students. So, as an example, using culturally relevant behavioral expectations, things like offering language, accessible communication for families, making sure that students feel a sense of belonging and representation in their classrooms. Those are all practices that we might have to go into the redesign. Equity in the world of PBIS is not solely about access. It's about meaningful participation and support. Of course, that has to happen first through access. However, the primary goal there being meaningful participation and support for all. So this is a very, very basic model of what it looks like at schools level. And you might come to be familiar with the triangle. That triangle is famous in the world of behavioral interventions. So sometimes we see it as 3 tiers, sometimes we see it as 4. The general idea stays the same. In the traditional PBIS model, where they look at 3 tiers, The first tier is going to be our green here, the one that says all, and this is universal. These are intervention supports, interventions, practices that are really supportive of most students. And they're meant to support all students, but they work very well for about 80% of students in a school or in a classroom, right? They apply to every single person. Every single person can have access to these supports or should have access to these supports. And for the most part, that's all that 80%, that's all the supports that about 80% of your population is going to need. Great. However, we also know that doing everything one way is not going to be the only way that it works out, because some students require more than just what everyone else gets, right? Some students are going to require more, and this is what we would call tier 2. These are going to be targeted supports. This is really going to apply to 10 to 15% of your people in any given population, a school or in a classroom. Not many are going to, some are going to need additional supports outside of what everyone else gets. However, it's not going to be a huge number of students, right? Big picture thinking, I would maybe say this is students who have mild to moderate support needs, might need a little bit extra, but nothing too crazy. With that little bit extra, they get to where they need to be in terms of progressing and growing the way that we expect everyone to. And then we get tier 3. And these are going to be individualized supports. Now we are targeting very, very specific individual students. This is going to be 1 to 5% of your students who require the highly personalized, often quite intensive supports. This is few comparative to all the rest of the students who require supports within a school or in a classroom. Quite few are going to require that one-on-one, hand over hand, that every 2-minute check-in or sticker, like very specific individualized sticker system. This is going to be intensive for just a few students. We'll talk about how to support students at each level for the next few weeks, but a quick overview here in the slides as well. So when we look at tier 1 universal supports, it's really the foundation, right? The bottom piece here is the foundation of the PBIS model. This is where you define school-wide or classroom behavioral expectations, things like be safe, be respectful, be responsible. We see those quite often. What does be safe mean? Define them, teach them. What does be respectful mean? Define them, teach them. What does be responsible mean? Define them, teach them. We have to make actual definitions for these words and not assume that students understand what we mean by saying be safe, be respectful, be responsible, regardless of age of individual. You could be dealing with high school seniors, you could be dealing with first graders, third graders, seventh graders, doesn't matter. We all have to establish the expectations for what the class rules are. But we are going to explicitly teach those expectations across settings. So if the whole school is doing a PBIS system, everyone in the school, there's one system for the whole school. That means the entire school needs to be on the same, everybody needs to get taught what be safe, be respectful, be responsible means. Every single person needs to get taught what that means. It has to be very, very clear to every single person. Meaning that we also have to use a common language for behavior, right? I can't say, oh, be safe means you keep your hands to yourselves, and that's all I've taught you, when a whole other classroom or most of the school says be safe is keep your hands to yourself. Because we're in an urban environment, it means also be aware of your surroundings. It means also these things and other things and whatever other else it could mean. But I only taught one piece. We have to use very common language for everything. We have to make sure we're all using the same expectations as well. We're going to acknowledge and reinforce positive behavior consistently. So recognize when a behavior has occurred that is the behavior that we wanted, right? But we are going to reinforce that behavior and in hopes of it increasing or continuously happening. So students coming to school on time, we give every single student come through the door is greeted super excitedly and happily when they're in school on time, and the big cheer party ends once school starts, because we all got to go to our classrooms now, meaning that students who come in late miss out on the big cheer time part, welcome to class, welcome to school party that happens every morning. That'd be a fun way to start the school. A fun way to start there. It happens every single morning. And that means we are reinforcing those positive behaviors that students don't want to miss out on the morning party. So let's get them here in school for that morning party on time so they can have it every day. We are going to use minor respectful responses to behavior errors. So what I mean by minor and respectful, it means that we are not making the biggest deal out of minor infractions. We are redirecting students towards making the correct ones. We're having them understand where it is that they made an error and how they can fix it the next time. And we'll reinforce that behavior the next time it happens as well. We'll positively reinforce it. But we are responding appropriately to minor infractions, right? We're not detention for you if you didn't exactly do this thing. We are working on appropriate reactions to the scenario. And we are always going to collect data on what's working and what's not. Honestly, we're going to collect data to make our decisions about what's working and what's not. So if your school isn't, or classroom isn't really grounded in strong tier 1 systems, I'm going to just say that students are more likely to escalate into higher tiers of need. So if we don't have a really good, strong system where the majority of students are going to be, where they all understand the expectations, they all understand the rules, they're getting praised for continuously doing the thing they're supposed to be doing, we are taking the data and ensuring and adjusting practices however needed to ensure that the majority of students, again, about 80% of students, are really strong in their recognition of this is what they needed to do well, to grow, to succeed in school. But when we have a very weak tier 1 system, nobody's doing anything all at once, we're all using different terms, I'm teaching something different here, you're teaching something different, and the dean of discipline gives attention to anybody they see coming in late to school, regardless of a situation. That's a really weak system, and it's going to just get us students who end up needing way more of tier 2 and tier 3 supports than should be expected. So let's look at tier 2. Tier 2 is adding a layer of targeted supports for students who don't respond to the universal strategies alone. So again, every single student will be able to get tier 1 supports and access tier 1 supports. But if those alone aren't working or they're not effective enough, that's where we start to add some tier 2s. These supports might include things like small group instructions, check-in or check-out systems with a mentor or a member, daily behavioral report cards, increased family communication, additional reinforcement and prompting. Tier 2, in this case, is still proactive. We are not, hopefully, ever waiting for students to be in crisis in order for us to identify that they needed help, right? This was an old model. It's called the wait to fail model, seen in special education. And it was like, well, we'll just wait for students to fail to identify who needs help. That's a horrible way to identify who needs help when we could have helped them throughout the process of them potentially failing and prevented them from failing. So we are in the proactive side of things. We need to identify needs early and provide supports to keep students engaged and successful. Again, meeting in your teams and figuring out these students aren't responding to the level 1, a tier 1 universal support. They might need a little bit extra. And then we provide a little bit extra. But what happens if that little bit extra tier 2 doesn't work? Then we have to look at a tier 3. And a tier 3 is really where we're going to start looking at the world of special education a little bit more. This is your intro to, let's say, intro to like identifying or supporting students. So tier 3 is going to be for students with most significant behavioral or academic needs, or both. And in these cases, we might need to take it a step further and say, well, they didn't respond to anything in tier 1, and they didn't really respond to anything in tier 2. And before we just go ahead and start giving more supports in tier 3, we might need to get down and into the crux of the issue and look at why these behaviors are occurring more specifically. And by doing that, or engaging in this process, it's called creating a functional behavior assessment. In the functional behavior assessment, it has to be conducted by someone who understands how to do one, but usually a school psych or an ABA person who comes into the school system. Sometimes a special ed teacher, but they usually should have a little bit of training or experience doing them. Special ed coordinator, it really depends who is qualified to do it. They're not particularly difficult to do per se, but it does require you to understand the process and what you're looking at and doing things maybe third party view. So a functional behavior assessment is going to be needed. And based on the results of that functional behavior assessment, a student might require a behavior intervention plan. If the behavior is more than can be dealt with just universal or targeted supports, we need intensive supports here, individualized supports, and we might have to very specifically create a plan for this individual student through a behavior intervention plan. It's a BIP. In this behavior intervention plan, we are in this process here with the functional behavior assessment and the BIP. It should be coordinated by a behavioral team at the school, again, that supports the student support team, usually at the school. That collaboration should also begin to include special education teams, related service providers, mental health staff, if there's any, or connections to. It should certainly include the family. If we're really getting into addressing it, individualized intensive behaviors, we don't do this in a vacuum on our own. We got to bring in the whole troops. We are all teachers and workers of this student. We are all going to come in here and work on this together to support this student. Tier 3 individualized supports are usually going to require an adjustment of the environment or expectations in some highly individualized ways, meaning that this student is usually within their behavior intervention plan, the student is going to be receiving something quite different than what the majority of the students in the school are, because what's been proven is they don't respond to what the majority of the students in the school are responding to. They need something quite different. So the supports at the tier 3 level are intensive, personalized, and data-driven, and they require significant, strong collaboration across that student support team. All right. So I've mentioned that PBIS can be done in a school setting versus the classroom setting, and or both. PBIS is not simply just a school-wide system. It lives in the classroom as well. Classroom PBIS basically uses the exact same structure. And I would say most PBIS systems started within classrooms before they kind of became school-wide practices that are seen today. In the classroom PBIS system, the exact same thing needs to happen of definition of routines and expectations, teaching very explicitly, using reinforcement and feedback, collecting and using data to make adjustments. The difference is that at the classroom level, it's happening within your 4 walls, right? At the school level, it's happening within the whole school's building's walls. You control what if any kind of system is happening within your classroom. If your school also has a school-wide PBIS system in play, yours should be aligned with what the school has. You should not really be creating your own completely entirely different system that has either no connection to the school-wide thing. If you have a classroom system and your school has a school system, yours should really be connected. Those two should be connected in some sort of fashion or way, because students should really understand classroom is a part of school and the whole thing goes together. So later on in this summer semester, you are going to be creating a classroom management plan, and this is kind of going to go into this world here. So a little baby introduction for you all. And very finally here, I want you to take a pause and reflect moment. I want you to think about your own school or classroom experiences, if you have been in them already. And I'd like to know which of the PBIS tiers is strongest in what you've observed. Would it be a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3? What tier might need more development or attention from your perspective? Just again, based off your own reflections here. Which tier might need more development or attention? And then what is one specific system, practice, or mindset from PBIS that you want to try or revisit? We're going to remember that PBIS is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a flexible framework designed to support the whole student, many students, all students, the whole school. By implementing strong systems, using data, selecting evidence-based practices, focusing on meaningful outcomes, and centering equity, those are those 5 key factors, we build schools and classrooms that are safe, inclusive, and effective.